Okay, I hope everybody's back from lunch, and I would like to start our first session of the afternoon. For those who don't know me, my name is Deniz Beyazit. I was named this morning. I'm an assistant curator in the Department of Islamic Art at the Metropolitan, and I'm very pleased to introduce the first speaker who will talk about Nishapur. It's Dr. Marika Sardar, who is staff in our department. Marika graduated in 2007 from the Institute of Fine Arts of New York University with a thesis entitled Golconda Through Time, a Mirror of the Evolving Deccan. She works at the Met, and actually she started her career at the museum already in 2002, while still a graduate student when she was writing for the Timeline Art History. In 2006, she became Coleman Fellow in the Department of Islamic Art, and in 2008, Research Assistant. Since 2009, she is Research Associate, and within all these years, she got involved in many projects, and she did research on the collection, all beside her studies at university and her own research on the site of Golconda. She also has taught at NYU and Rutgers University in New Jersey, and actually since 2010, she acts as the review's field editor for books and related media in Islamic art of the College Art Association. While parts of her research has been published in articles and papers, we are all very much looking forward to see her book she is writing on about Golconda in the Deccan. I hope it will come out soon. I also must cite her many contributions in the Met's Masterpieces catalog, and more important, together with Dr. Navina Haidar, she has co-edited the volume which recently came out, Sultans of the South, The Arts of India's Deccan. She is actually at home and an expert in artistic traditions of India and especially the Deccan, but also she contributes with original research on the Met's Nishapur collection. For today, Marika has prepared a paper entitled Nishapur in the New Galleries, New Research and New Contexts for the Metropolitan Museum's Excavations. Please, Marika, I would like you to come and give the paper.
Thank you, Denise. And just one small note, we'll be doing the questions at the end of all 4 papers for this session, again this afternoon. So, in the 1930s, the Metropolitan Museum conducted excavations at Nishapur, a city in northeastern Iran. Since that time, the material they found has been an important part of the museum's galleries of art from that region, and it features again in the galleries for the art of the Arab lands, Turkey, Iran, Central Asia, and later South Asia that opened last fall. In my talk this afternoon, I'm going to give you a behind-the-scenes look at how we planned the new Nishapur galleries in this space, and I'll present the didactic materials that we've developed to surround the display and provide a context for the objects that was lacking in earlier installations. As you can see from these photos, there was an abundance of Nishapur objects in the galleries installed in 1975, on view until 2003, but cases contained disparate materials, including objects that were not from the excavations, and there was little labeling or information available. In the new installation, we hope that the groupings of objects make more sense to the visitor, and that by reading the labels and exploring the touchscreen monitor, he or she will both understand the material and the larger site from which it came. All of this will provide a background for the new studies that are being done on Nishapur and related sites by my colleagues on this panel. Their work represents the ultimate goal of this installation, to represent Nishapur to the public and to open the door for further research on this important body of material. To provide a brief overview, Nishapur is in the northeastern province of Iran called Khorasan. The city's history is well known from a rich body of textual sources. It was founded in the 3rd century AD under the Sasanians and flourished through the 13th century, when after the Mongol invasion of the city and several earthquakes, its citizens moved at least twice before settling at the location where the modern city of Nishapur stands today. During these 9 centuries, Nishapur served as a regional capital under several different dynasties. It was a center for religious scholarship, where as many as 39 madrasas operated. It produced cotton and textiles, as we heard yesterday, and it was an important stop along the trade route known as the Silk Road, on which goods moved between China, the Middle East, and Europe. The Met's excavations were the first formal explorations of this important city, undertaken between 1935 and 40, when the team was forced to stop because of World War II, and with a final season in the winter of 1947 to 48. The excavations revealed much about the manufacture of objects at Nishapur, especially ceramics, and revealed a lot about the city's architecture as well, as they uncovered a range of buildings from houses to ceremonial structures, mosques, and baths. While these excavations were very important and fruitful, there are limits to their archaeological value. We have no field notes from the excavators, no explanation as to how they decided where to dig or what their expectations were in starting each trench. There are hundreds of photos in our archives, but we see sites at the beginning and end of excavation with little in between. Publications of the site do not mention all of the named excavated areas, and only a few have been extensively described. The notebooks recording finds were obviously not kept as the objects were uncovered, as sequential pages have finds from different sites and many seemingly specific locations in them, such as Area B, field number 114, listed for the object above, remain unidentified. In the photographic record, objects are shown already excavated and in some cases already cleaned, reconstructed, and restored. Because of this, it was not possible to present a rigorous stratigraphic analysis of the material in the galleries, but much else could be done to provide a new experience of Nishapur. This gallery forms a counterpoint to the 13 other galleries in this wing of the museum, which are devoted to the highest forms of courtly art, and so our approach here was very different. As in the earlier installation, the focus of the Nishapur area is the reconstructed room from a house in the excavation site that was called Tepe Sabz Pushan. The idea for this gallery, first introduced in the 1975 installation, is to give a sense of a typical domestic space of about the 10th century. But the text panel in the room and information on the touchscreen monitor make it more explicit that the panels have come from several different rooms in the same house. And the video that we are unable to play here, but is available for you to all see in the galleries on the monitor there, places the panels within the house where they were found and gives you a sense of the neighborhood surrounding the house as well. And here I should say that the creation of the visual materials that I've been showing you were made in collaboration with the museum's Department of Digital Media. So also new to this installation is a case with objects from the Sabz Pushan site. While it has not been possible to associate finds with this house at the exact times that the stucco panels were installed there, the range of household items shown here are roughly of the same period and complement the gallery setting evoking a home. In the future, we hope that the drawers in this case will hold more material from Sabz Pushan. Outside the room, objects from other parts of Nishapur are displayed in 3 additional cases and on a wall in which several large architectural fragments are arranged. Within the largest case shown on the bottom right, the objects are organized by thematic group, by medium, and where possible, by date. Some groupings introduce a narrative to the material. For instance, in imports and imitations, objects are presented as evidence for Nishapur's position on a trade route, where goods from other parts of the world were available, and where particularly prized or hard-to-obtain items were imitated by local craftsmen. The group of unidentified objects raises the point that archaeologists cannot always determine what an object is, and the items shown here include a sphero-conical container and a type of glass vessel whose functions scholars have vigorously debated. Other kinds of groupings, such as buffware and other Nishapur ceramic types, glass and stone, approach the material as exemplars of craft, focusing on technical advances or design motifs that make the selected object special, or that distinguish wares only made in Nishapur. This arrangement also reveals other attributes of Nishapur and its history. For instance, in the 9th century, imports from the Western Abbasid Empire were more prevalent, while in the later 9th and 10th centuries, the Khorasan trade nexus must have been stronger, as ceramics from the region surrounding Nishapur, whose aesthetic properties are dramatically different from the earlier ones, are found in greater quantities. But by the 11th century, all of these types were replaced by blue-glazed wares more in line with what was being produced in Western Iran. This is demonstrated in the chronological arrangement of the case, in which the earlier material is on the right, facing the early Sabz-Pushan room, and the later material is on the left. In the new display, the range of architectural decoration on buildings throughout the site is also explored. From the earliest known Muqarnas fragments, shown on the upper left here, to examples of wall painting, carved stucco, and terracotta, the finds from Nishapur demonstrate that a multiplicity of decorative styles could be popular at the same time. To provide a context for these objects, much background information is now available on the touchscreen monitor in the gallery. Firstly, visitors can learn about the excavations, the museum curators who participated in them, and their day-to-day life at the site. Secondly, they can explore Nishapur's history and its physical growth through the course of different occupations. And we prepared this series of maps based on textual sources that describe the addition of buildings by different rulers and the expansion and movement of the city's population due to influxes of wealth or destructive invasions, factional rioting, or earthquakes. In another important development, the museum's excavations are related to this physical history of the city. Prior to this time, the only guide to the site and the places where the excavators worked was this rather confusing map, on which modern features overlaid the ancient site and dig locations. Combining information from maps created by Richard Bulliet, my co-panelist and historian of Nishapur, and the excavation team headed by Monique Kevran and Rajab Labaf Khaniki, who worked at the site between 2005 and 2008, we were able to correctly locate the excavation sites on a satellite view of the medieval city. There were several distortions in that earlier map I showed you, and to put the sites within the context of the ancient city, the green shading you see here. With no fortification walls to demarcate the actual extent of the city, this shading is approximate, but shown in this perspective, it becomes clearer where the excavators work. We understand that they touched down on a small part of the medieval city center, which expanded from the 3rd century citadel outwards, and that much of what they dug was probably on the western suburbs of the city. In addition, these excavation sites are described in a monitor with a brief description of the finds at each. Creating all of these materials involved months of research, but through the course of this work, several areas for more in-depth study of the objects emerge, which I hope to pursue in the future. The first relates to the beautiful, striking group of ceramics from Nishapur and the surrounding region that are decorated with calligraphy, either blessings or, as in the case of this platter, pithy proverbs. While scholars have studied these from several angles, it seems that a closer study of the scripts would be fruitful, for while generally classed as epigraphic wares, there's a wide variety in the calligraphic forms found on these pieces. And here I show you some preliminary groupings of the vessels from the excavations, which further research might help relate to certain places of production or give different dates to. Another area for research stems from this unusual jug with very faint writing on it in Arabic script and a small image of a demon, which is in the detail on the top. After conservator Amy Jones noticed this writing on this object, I started to search for more objects like it and found 2 more in our own storerooms, excavated by the museum at the site of Qasri Abu Nasr near Shiraz, another from the Raqqa excavations, and a 4th from excavations at Ray. My initial thought is that they relate to the Aramaic incantation bowls found in great numbers at sites like Nippur, but are an early Islamic period extension of the practice of writing on an object that is then filled with a substance to be drunk for protection from evil spirits. I look forward to pursuing these avenues soon, but in the meantime, my colleagues on this panel have much to show you on their work on Nishapur.
Well, thank you, Marika. So we can pass to the second speaker. It is Mark, I hope I spell it right, Mark Wypyski. He's senior research scientist in the Department of Scientific Research at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where he specializes in the application of electron microscopy and X-ray microanalysis in the study of glass, metals, paint, stone, ceramics, and other materials to help answer conservation, dating, and provenance questions. Before starting his career at the Met in museum science, before starting his career in museum science, Mr. Wypyski earned degrees in microbiology, art history, and art conservation. He has been at the museum since 1983, first as an intern, and then later as a scientist in the Objects Conservation Department, and in 2004, he helped from the then newly created Department of Scientific Research. During his time at the museum, he has published extensively in the field of museum studies, with research concentrating on the compositional characterization of historical vitreous materials, including studies of ancient Egyptian glass, Roman glass, and Islamic glass, as well as European enameled glass, copper, silver, and gold, and chemical means of distinguishing ancient objects from modern reproductions. The vocabulary is a little bit technical for me, so I'm sorry for my spelling. Today, he contributes to the conference with a paper. It's called Scientific Investigation of Early Islamic Glass from Nishapur. And I would like to come Mark Wypyski to the podium.
Thank you. You get an A+ on the pronunciation of my name among the other words. I'd like to speak a little bit about some of my studies on the glass from Nishapur. This is the catalog of the glass finds that was published by Jens Kroger after the death of Charles Wilkinson in 1995, where he cataloged about 300 of the glass finds from the excavations. These are mainly dated to the 9th to 10th centuries. And to quote Kroger, the period of the Nishapur finds is precisely the time when Islamic glass manufacture in Iran reached its finest point. And I wanted to make the point that despite the problems with the excavation records that Marika spoke of, there are hundreds and hundreds of fragments and glass objects that are attributed to Nishapur in museums throughout the world. But to my knowledge, and I don't have much knowledge of the most recent excavations, these are the only ones that have a definite provenance. So they're extremely important in the study of Islamic glass. Many different types of glass vessels were found. Kroger has organized them in the catalog by the way the glasses were made. There were many relatively simple, free-blown glass vessels, mainly colorless, some what I call near colorless, or very lightly colored, probably not intentionally colored, as well as a few blue glass pieces, green glass, and I'll show some of the beads, which have different colors as well. Along with relatively simple vessels, there are more sophisticated decoration, if I'm using the right term, such as these, the goblet fragment, bottle fragment, with applied decoration done with molten glass. There are also a large number of vessels and fragments with wheel-cut decoration, sometimes very intricate patterns of decoration on beakers, bottles, bowl fragments. The fragment in the middle is actually a dark blue, but this is a black and white photo because the blue photo didn't show up very well. There are also a few individual pieces which don't fit into the different decorative groupings. There are two fragments with incised decoration, both plates or large bowls, or fragments of a plate or a large bowl. These are incised decorations, sometimes called scratch decorated. And there were only the two fragments of those. There's a single fragment of luster painted, probably a bottom of a bottle, and this one somewhat odd dark blue glass fragment, possibly from a bowl, that was described as a relief cut decoration piece. And I'll talk some more about that later. As I mentioned, there's also a group of beads. Most of them multicolored, opaque colors, mixture of opaque colors and translucent colors. After the excavation of the 300 pieces that Kroger catalogs, the Met ended up with about half of those back here. The rest stayed in Iran, fair enough. But there were also a number of pieces that were recorded and then discarded, and it's not clear what happened with those pieces, why they were discarded, but it's one of the mysteries of the excavation records. The preparations for the reopening of the galleries, among a lot of other work, included re-examination and treatment, where necessary, of the Nishapur material. My part of that, being that I'm hung up on glass analysis, was to analyze as many of these pieces as possible as they went through the conservation department. Many of the pieces were disassembled during conservation, undoing old treatments, and then reassembled. So I was able to get them in the middle of that process to take some samples for analysis. As it was said before, my specialty is scanning electron microscopy and X-ray microanalysis, which was the technique used to analyze these glasses. This technique measures, I won't go into detail, but it's an extremely useful technique. It measures characteristic X-rays that are produced by each element when they're bombarded by an electron beam. You can measure most elements down to about 0.01% by weight. And it's one of the reasons this technique is so useful is that you can work with very, very small samples. For glass, generally a cubic millimeter or less, just a few milligrams in size. So you don't need to knock a big chunk of glass off of your object just so you can say what it's made of. This is also a non-destructive technique, which is not appreciated sometimes with this means of analysis. It's also possible to do surface analysis if the object will fit into the electron microscope, which limits the object to something about this big. You get better information generally from a sample, so we usually work with that. And because it's non-destructive, after we do this type of analysis, you can take the same samples and analyze them with another method, as we're doing now with a lot of these samples, where you can get much finer trace element information in the parts per million to parts per billion range, which our equipment is not capable of. Before I talk about my results, I should talk a bit about how glass is produced. And again, I'll keep this very brief. Glass is made with two basic raw materials, and throughout history, basically two things are put together to make the basic glass. This is a source of silica, commonly sand or quartz pebbles, and a fluxing agent to reduce the temperature of pure silica, which is very high and not a very workable temperature. It also needs to be pointed out that ancient glass workers were not working with purified raw materials. They did not have pure silica source to work with. A flux would commonly be natron, which is a natural mineral source of mainly sodium carbonate, but a lot of other stuff in there as well, or plant ash. And they're not working with purified materials like a modern glass maker would. Sand, very, very commonly used in glass production, probably not from a beach quite this nice. And sand is mostly silicon, little bits of quartz. But if you look up close at sand, there's a lot of other stuff in there. There's lots of other minerals of different composition. There's bits of shell, coral, other stuff, which can add quite a bit to your silica source, aluminum, magnesium, calcium, so on. So when you're looking at glass compositions, they're actually very complicated and can vary quite a bit depending on what the raw materials are and where the raw materials actually came from. Scientists love plots and graphs, and so I won't inflict too many of these on you today, but it's a convenient way to show groups of data. This is a plot showing sodium oxide content versus calcium oxide. And the most common glass by far throughout history and today is what is called soda lime silica glass. And as we found with the Nishapur glass, it's the same thing here. Almost all of them can be categorized as soda lime silica glass, sodium ranging from about 11% to almost 20% in some of the glasses. There are two in the middle, there we go, in the middle there that stand out. They're still soda lime silica glass with much lower sodium than the bulk of the glasses. And then one guy standing out down here with very low sodium, somewhere around 1%. And that is not a soda lime silica glass. That is a different type of glass altogether. But these three are really the only ones that stand out from the crowd in this way. Looking at some of the other major components of the glass, is magnesia, magnesium oxide, and potash, potassium oxide. And if we look at these components, you start to see some grouping, 3 different types of glass, all soda lime silica glass. But these glasses tend to have higher magnesium, somewhat less potassium. These are in the middle, a little bit lower magnesium, higher potassium, and these with, again, slightly higher potassium and lower magnesium on these. And then, again, there's always the ones in the crowd that have to stand out. These 2 have rather low potassium and magnesium, and I'll talk about those a bit later too. But I just wanted to point out we're starting to see compositional groups, and there's 3 main groups, and I have very cleverly called them type 1, 2, and 3. And here in this plot with alumina versus phosphate, again, you're seeing a separation of groups by these features. They're really separating out here with low aluminum, higher aluminum, and even rather very high aluminum, high phosphorus, and then this group in the middle. Oops. So the type 1 glass, high magnesium, lower aluminum, and phosphate. Most of these, not all of them are, but the majority of these are colorless, near colorless, with maybe a faint tinge, with wheel cut decoration, what I think of as a more sophisticated type of decoration. The type 2 glass is, for the most part, more of the simple, free-blown glass vessels, but also a few with the more sophisticated type of decoration, like the blue glass plate with incised decoration. What I found interesting also that we have, as I mentioned, there's 2 fragments with this incised decoration, and compositionally they're very different. The other fragment fits in with the type 1 glass, and the blue fits in with the type 2. So one thought with this project is we would give some information about where the incised glass pieces may have come from. And all we can say is, well, it looks like they may have come from 2 different places. And the type 3 glass, which also, again, relatively simple vessels, but also a lot of the beads fit in with this type 3 glass. I mentioned before in the first plot the 3 outliers. 2 of them are green glass with about 6% sodium and contain 30% or so lead oxide. Both of these were green glass Molar flasks. And the third outlier with the very low sodium was this one green glass bead, which contains about 70% lead oxide. Aside from some of the colors in the beads, the opaque colors, white, yellow, red, these are the only glasses that contain any significant amount of lead and really stand out in that way. I mentioned this piece before as it was initially described and was thought for many years to be relief cut glass decoration, whereas that the decoration is raised above the surface by relief cutting. But what was found during the conservation examination is that it's actually a very rare type of cameo glass. That is, there are different layers of glass cut to form the decoration. So this is a computer-generated model of what the glass would look like if that top weathered corrosion layer was removed. You have a base of dark blue glass, a thin middle layer of white opaque glass, and then a top thin blue layer on top. So there is actually only, Cameo Glass is known from the Islamic world. It's very well known from the Roman world, but there is only one other known Islamic three-layer cameo glass in existence, at least that I know of, at the Corning Museum of Glass. And it's, the decoration is rather similar. This is done with amber glass, but again with the base layer of thin white and then the top layer of the same color. The compositions, though, the white glass layers in both are very similar, which I know because I was able to analyze the Corning piece, thanks to David Whitehouse, at the Corning Museum of Glass. But the base layers are very different in composition, aside from the color. This is an image from, in this scanning electron microscope, of the blue layer and then the white layer. The white layer fits in with the type 2 glass, is colored with white tin oxide crystals. The blue layer is colored with cobalt, but is one of these two exceptions that I pointed out with very low magnesium and potassium, which, again, doesn't fit in with most of the glass found at Nishapur. It's a very unusual type of glass for this period. What I found also very interesting is that it's obviously, these are two very different glasses in the same object. The Corning cameo piece, both of the glass types, both of the glass layers fit in with type 2 glass. So where this blue glass came from, we don't know. Or I don't know, anyway. So I'm not going to give any conclusions now because I don't have a lot of conclusions. We're still left with a lot of questions that hopefully we'll be working on and answer a few of them. From the excavation records, there was no evidence of glass making in these excavations. New excavations, again, I don't know if they will find any or if they have found any, but I have not heard of any. The old excavations did not find evidence of glass making. They did find evidence of ceramic production. So the major question is, where did this glass come from? Was all of it imported? Was any of it locally produced? Do the different types of glass, as I do suspect, represent regional types of glass? The type 1 glass is very similar to glass, a lot of glass found in Iraq. And the type 3 glass is very similar to some pieces known from Central Asia, but not a lot of glass is known from that, or at least, well, provenance glass is known from there. So it's a direction, but it's nothing very firm. The type 2 glass, I suspect, is locally produced, and I think we'll find evidence of that, but we don't have it yet. So, mention work in progress now, compositional analysis of glass from other excavations, hopefully to expand our database. I'm working right now on a group of glass from Samara, also Tisafan from glass here at the Metropolitan Museum, and also glass from Saraf, and I know the British Museum is working on glass from Mirv, I don't know if I pronounced that correctly, in Central Asia. So I think very soon we'll have a very good, a much larger database to say where different types of glass may have come from. And we're also working to do detailed trace element analysis. I'm working with the University of Cardiff in Wales to possibly do some fingerprinting of these different types of glass, which may help us pinpoint exactly where some of these different glasses came from. So before I leave, I would just like to acknowledge several people, Sheila Canby, who allowed me to work on this project and was, I think, very accommodating about my sampling things without destroying any object. And also, I want to thank all the conservators who worked on the glass. I don't have all their names because I'm not that type of person to be gracious enough to get everyone's name. But I do want to particularly thank Lisa Pelosi, who's conservator in charge of glass. Without her help, without all the conservators' help, I would not have been able to do this project. Thank you.
While the first two papers were about the material of the museum, our third speaker, Professor Richard Bulliet, will talk about Nishapur in history. Richard W. Bulliet is professor of Middle Eastern history at Columbia University, where he also directed the Middle East Institute of the School of International and Public Affairs for 12 years. Born in Rockford, Illinois in 1940, he came to Columbia in 1976 after undergraduate and graduate work at Harvard and 8 years as a faculty member at Harvard and Berkeley. He is a specialist on Iran, the social history of the Islamic Middle East, and the 20th century resurgence of Islam. Professor Bulliet has a very long list of publications, I can tell you, and here I will pick out some samples. His most recent scholarly work is Cotton, Climate, and Camels in Early Islamic Iran, A Moment in World History, which was published in 2009. His earlier books include Hunters, Herders, and Hamburgers, The Case for Islamo-Christian Civilization, Islam, The View from the Edge, Conversion to Islam in the Medieval Period, The Camel and the Wheel, and The Patricians of Nishapur. He has also written 5 novels, beginning with Kicked to Death by a Camel in 1973, and is co-author of a world history textbook, The Earth and Its Peoples. So today he will talk about Nishapur in history. Please, Professor Bulliet, come and give your talk.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here to talk about Nishapur. I'm not an art historian, I'm not an archaeologist. I do know a lot about Nishapur. The reason for this is that this was the area where I did the city I worked on for my doctoral thesis that I got back in 1967. And so I first went to Nishapur in 1966. I believe that this is the first lecture I've ever given actually on the history of Nishapur as a physical place, because my work has been primarily on the population of Nishapur as a social historian and economic historian. But when I had this opportunity to talk about Nishapur, excuse me. When I had this opportunity to talk about Nishapur more broadly in the history of the city, it was rather nostalgic, going back to when I first went there. Let me start by pointing out some things about the location. There's Nishapur, and here to the right of it is Mashhad. Mashhad is the second largest city in Iran. It's a shrine city and also a commercial city of great size and industry. And it had a precursor city in the pre-Islamic period known as Tus. Tus was divided into two sections, Nauqan and Tabiran, and it is quite apparent from work that has been done, particularly by the historian, one of my students, Pervane Pourshariati, that Tus was a royal center in the Sassanid period. There was a palace there. It was a illustrious location, and some of the most famous Iranian cultural figures come from Tus. Nizam al-Mulk, the great author of a guide for governance, al-Ghazali, perhaps the greatest of the medieval theologians, Ferdowsi, the author of the Shahnameh, the Iranian national epic, the philosopher Nasiruddin at-Tusi, to name the most prominent ones. There is virtually nobody from Nishapur of that same degree of prominence. And yet, Nishapur was a huge city, and Tus was not a huge Islamic city. So one of the issues you have to get into in talking about Nishapur is why there is a city at Nishapur. It makes sense for there to be a city here at Mashhad. This is a mountain range that extends across from the southern shore of the Caspian Sea across this way, and Mashhad is located right at the end of the mountain range. This means that Mashhad was the point where you had one trade route that goes up into Central Asia and the Silk Road, and another one that goes down into Herat and into lower Afghanistan and eventually India. There was another divergence of trade routes, one that goes up here through Boj Nord and north of the mountains from Mashhad, and the other that goes south of the mountains through Nishapur to Sabzavar, Semnon, and further west. The point is that Mashhad, or Tus, really is a crossroads. It is the place where the trade routes diverge. Nishapur is not. It is presented as a crossroads in the gallery upstairs for obvious reasons, because it is a huge metropolis. But in pure geographic terms, that's your crossroads. It's your junction point is at Mashhad. Nishapur is some 60, 70 kilometers west of Mashhad at the foot of a fairly low mountain range. So there's a question as to why there is a city, a huge city at Nishapur, and not a huge city in the early Islamic period at Tus. I will be arguing that it's precisely because Tus was a royal city. It's actually the burial place of the Caliph Harun al-Rashid and the burial place of the 8th Shiite Imam, Ali Rida, and that's why it's called Mashhad, meaning a shrine. It's the shrine of Ali Rida. But it's precisely because it is, Nishapur was not part of the pre-Islamic royal organization of Iran. Now, the Met people went to Iran in 1936, I believe. I arrived 40 years later in 1966. And this is what it looked like. What you were seeing in the distance, and by the distance I mean right along here, this is the walled pre-Islamic city of Nishapur. But this is not your standard Middle East, look at this interesting mound picture, because where I'm standing, putting myself cleverly in the picture, is actually in the middle of the city. In other words, everything was built up from here for a very long distance, and the walled city was comparatively small. Here we have another shot of that area at the time in '66. Another one, this one showing the water system, which typically is a series of mounds that are the surface manifestation of underground canals, because there is no river at Nishapur. There is no surface water supply. This is an important factor. There was a time in the early 20th century when certain citizens of Indianapolis prided themselves on being residents of the largest city in the world, not on navigable water. Maybe that was all Indiana had to claim for itself at the time, but the fact of the matter is that if you don't have surface water, you have issues dealing with habitation. When you have surface water, or when you have subsurface water, it typically comes out in a rivulet at the end of the underground canal that will track along through here into the village, another one along here following these willow trees. So the water is underground, and it's part of the water table is tapped in the mountains to the north of the city, and then you'll have a mile to 2 mile underground run before the water comes out on the surface. Here is the walled city in 1966, and here on the northern edge of it is the citadel at that time. Both of these are thoroughly potholed and dug by treasure hunters. This is inside the citadel, and that is typical of that entire built-up area of the ruins. These are all potsherds and brick bats on the ground. There's no trouble finding potsherds in Nishapur. I might mention that with regard to glass, first of all, I have Nishapur glass that I'd be happy to let anybody borrow who wanted to analyze it. But secondly, walking over the ruins of Nishapur, the ratio of surface potsherds to glass shards is at least 10 to 1. You have noticeable amounts of glass, but you have vastly more quantities of ceramic potsherds. By comparison, I walked through a ghost town on the border between California and Nevada, and the ratio of glass to ceramics was the reverse. It was about 10 to 1. Vast amounts of broken glass, and occasionally cups and saucers from some old restaurant or something. But the glass is not rare, but it is not frequent either. Now, here are the aerial photographs of Nishapur. Here is your citadel, right there. And this is the walled area that is elevated that goes down from it. This is the railroad that was built through in the 1950s. If you go to Nishapur today, you will probably want to visit the monument to the poet Omar Khayyam, and that is located over here. I'm getting myself a little skewed. It's right around here. But the actual tombstone of Omar Khayyam is up here on the traffic circle in front of Omar Khayyam High School. The monument was built by the Shah, who purchased land adjoining the shrine where the tombstone of Omar Khayyam was situated in the exterior wall of this shrine. But the tombstone is a fake. And the location of the monument is not the tomb of Omar Khayyam. It's Omar Kham is actually buried right around here somewhere. Well, that gets me into this question of how do you reconstruct an area like this? Here we have the citadel and the old city are located here. And that's what you had from the pre-Islamic period. This area here is the built-up extent of the medieval city at its peak sometime around 1000 AD. The build-up area is about 100 times greater than the area of the citadel and the inner city combined. For comparison terms, you might think that the inner city and the citadel combined, roughly the size of the Columbia University campus or the City College of the City University of New York campus. So we're dealing with an expansion that goes from something like 17 hectares up to 1,600 hectares. And that means a population growth that is somewhere between, let's say you start at 3,000 perhaps, you're going up to a population that certainly seems to be between 100 and 200,000. So it's, and you could even make an argument for 300,000, but you assume that the outlying districts of the city had a lot of empty space and gardens and so on. Now, establishing this perimeter, there's no way you can do it very reliably except on the ground. So what I did was simply to stand somewhere here in the middle and walk in different directions, looking at the ground until I ran out of potsherds. It was absolutely distinct when you were out of town. You know, your potsherds went within 10 or 15 feet from being the standard litter underfoot to not being there at all. So I think that the perimeter is fairly reliable, but it doesn't mean that it was all occupied at the same time. I suspect in particular that this is a later extension of occupation because there is a wall here that represents, this is the city over here that I believe that was destroyed by the Mongols. This city over here, the older city, fell apart in the early 1100s, a century before the Mongols arrived. And it was a combination of internal factionalism and internecine fighting, plus earthquake, plus nomadic depredations. It was the destruction of one of the world's great cities. Now, I come back to this question of why there's a city at Nishapur. There is a pre-Islamic city. That's what this is. The citadel and the walled city, what I call the inner city. The Met excavators were, well, at least Charles Wilkinson, the one I talked to, absolutely convinced that there was nothing pre-Islamic here. Subsequent investigators have found pre-Islamic evidence of pre-Islamic habitation. But I think in some ways what Wilkinson thought was perhaps not wrong, because the excavations of the Met are all over here in the, as you saw from the Marika's paper, they're west and south of the old city. I don't believe there was any settlement outside the walled city and citadel in the pre-Islamic period. But the Met expedition did not excavate extensively within that area. So I think that the remains of the pre-Islamic Nishapur really have not yet been found. But textually speaking, it's, I think, an absolute certainty that this is where pre-Islamic Nishapur was. Now, why was it there? between Tus and, say, the city of Damran, much further to the west. It's the only large walled city and citadel. Some of the other places listed as cities are really more collections of villages, places like Sabzavar. So why is it here? It's not a crossroads. There's no bridge. There's no obvious transit point for commerce, assuming it's a caravan protection city. The modern history of Nishapur, written 15 years or so ago by an Iranian scholar, has the title Nishapur Shahr Firuzeh, Nishapur, the city of turquoise. And I think this may be important. There are turquoise mines about 25 miles into the mountains north of Nishapur. They are basically the only turquoise mines in Iran, or basically in the eastern part of the Middle East. And turquoise was an incredibly highly regarded precious stone in the medieval period. More highly regarded than those stones that required cutting, because it was soft enough that you could fabricate it, whereas diamonds were difficult to work with. So turquoise is terribly important. One of the things that you will notice when you go to the galleries, the Nishapur galleries, is that there's no turquoise. There is one ring and one bead on what's on display. I don't know what is in the storerooms, but clearly large quantities of turquoise were not part of the excavation. And there is no historic figure known for being involved in the turquoise trade, or even known for being involved in the jewelry trade. My guess is that the turquoise of Nishapur was the crown property, and that the general who was in command in Nishapur basically had this as a monopoly, and sent the turquoise westward, that it was not really a local product. These turquoise mines are still functioning. And that might explain why you had a city there, because it was exploiting a resource that was unique, that was highly valued. The only other two unusual or unique exports of Nishapur were rhubarb and edible earth as a medication. Edible earth is basically pure kaolin that you eat. It's kaopectate. You eat it for diarrhea. It ties you up. So they exported kaopectate from Nishapur and rhubarb in season. But the turquoise was a really high value item. Now, when the Arabs came, one of the striking things is Nishapur was not a big military center, unlike cities in the east like Merv or Balkh or Gorgan, Georgian. This was not a big garrison city. It was actually protected to a large degree from the north by the mountain range up here. To conquer Nishapur, you had to either come from the west, as the Arabs did, or come around the mountains past Tus in the east. Tus was a natural protection point, and that's the reason the Sassanids had it as their royal metropolis in the east. And yet an Arab army, an Arab garrison did come to Nishapur, and you do have Arabs who settle there. Now the question is, how do you settle in a place that has no water? If you say, well, you can build underground canals and produce water, and you tell a bunch of invading Arab armies, you know, you guys, if you can build an underground canal, you can have some water. They will not build an underground canal. They will force you to build an underground canal. But initially, what they want is running water. There are only two places that you have it. This stream here and this one over here. It is not a coincidence that this stream runs straight through the center of the later incarnation of Nishapur at Shadiyakh, And this one runs right next to the old city. And I think that the old city was built to have running water, running surface water. Now, there is a quarter of the city right in here to the east of the walled precinct that is called Hira. It's the most famous quarter of the medieval city, and it is explicitly named for a city in Iraq. And it supposedly is named by the Arabs who came from Hira and came to Nishapur. And that makes a great deal of sense. If you were an Arab army coming, you will settle where the water is. So you will settle along here. That is where you have access to the old city. They occupied the old city. They turned the old fire temple in the citadel into a mosque. But I think that they camped outside the old city along this stream. But what it indicates is that there was no buildup outside the old city prior to the coming of the Arabs, because that area was not built up. There was no village name that it took over. This was a newly settled area. Along that stream, you have a series of city quarters and cemeteries. This was the richest part of Nishapur. The Met did not dig any site in this area east of the old city. They were constrained at that time by places that they could get permission to dig having to do with the agricultural use that the land was being put to at the time. But the sad fact is that the really richest parts of Nishapur have never been excavated. Omar Khayyam is buried in the cemetery over here, as opposed to his tomb, which is supposedly over here, because we know that he's in the cemetery of Mulkabad, which adjoins the quarter of Hira. There's an area right along here, south, just past the railroad tracks, that appears from aerial photographs to be the site of the Jamia Mosque, the Congregational Mosque of Nishapur. That, to the best of my knowledge, has never been excavated. It was not excavated by the Met expedition. Then the Met expedition excavated sites over here, including sites along this road, and particularly along this road, then going north and south. You have a crossroads that was abundantly evident on the ground. You could actually feel that you were walking through the medieval bazaar, going east-west, and then the crossroads went north and south. I might remark in that context that the so-called spheroconical vessel that Marika showed, there was a store just north of the crossroads on the western side of the street that sold whatever was in those vessels. There were hundreds and hundreds of them lying on the surface broken. And it really makes it unlikely that, for example, these were hand grenades. You know, go to the bazaar, go to your hand grenade shop, stock up on hand grenade. It makes no sense at all. It makes a great deal more sense that this was a bar, that these are beer bottles. Iranian scholar Dr. Gouchani has made a very strong argument for these being beer bottles. But you can't tell a whole lot from what's on the surface. I wasn't permitted to dig. I was simply a graduate student, prowling around. The surface level for finds is subsurface throughout this whole area practically, somewhere around 12 to 15 feet down. And this is because this is an area of where dust is deposited. This is Aeolian dust deposit that has buried the ruins at that level. There is an enormous amount of treasure hunting, or was when I was there. Largely, I think, stimulated by the Met expedition. So that I would look at aerial photographs, see a mound, and then try and identify the mound, And when I would get there, I'd find that it was it was 6-10 feet below ground. Everything else had been excavated and carted away. It makes it extraordinarily difficult to figure out the topography of Nishapur. I was lucky in obtaining aerial photographs. I was happy to make them available to the Met for their exhibit. And it is one of the nice things about the exhibit upstairs is that you can actually see some coordination between what is on the ground, that we can tell from aerial photographs and reconstruction, and what the Met saw. I was unable to identify a single site from the sites that the Met had excavated in the 1930s. All of the mounds had disappeared by the time I got there. And the fact of the matter is, you found people digging for treasure all over the place. And one of the few ways you could actually find out anything, you couldn't go to them and say, "Oh, you're digging for treasure. What are you finding?" And they would say, "What do you want to buy?" And you would say, "Well, actually, I'm just a graduate student, but I don't want to buy anything." "Well, then I don't want to tell you anything." So I ended up buying a certain quantity of goods simply to be able to talk to the people who were excavating the site. And the range of things they were finding, and it was absolutely extraordinary. I mean, it's not as big as Cairo or Baghdad, but it is certainly one of the greatest cities of the medieval world, and one that is sadly forgotten almost everywhere, except here at the Metropolitan Museum of Modern Art. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor Bulliet, for this amazing, interesting paper. And so we have one more speaker for this Nishapur session. It is Dr. Martina Ruggiati, who will talk about a topic I think she worked on in her thesis. Dr. Ruggiati is a research fellow in Islamic archaeology and art history at the Sapienza University in Rome, where she teaches and proceeds her research. She received her PhD from the University of Naples L'Orientale in 2007 with a dissertation on the marble architectural decoration from Ghazni, Afghanistan, 11th to 13th century. She is a woman with lots of fieldwork experience and actually has participated in many excavation projects in Afghanistan, Iran, Syria, Jordan, but also Oman. Many articles present her research on the marbles of Ghazni, but she also has written on Iranian ceramics and on the collection of metalware of Grassi at the Vatican Museum. As I said, today she will talk about carved alabasters in Ghazni and Nishapur. Please, Dr. Ruggiati, come to the podium.
Thank you for the presentation. And before starting, I would like to thank the Islamic department for this invitation. I'm very glad and honored to have been included in this panel on Nishapur, and I would like to thank especially Marika for inviting me, thinking on me. When I was asked to participate to this symposium in Nishapur, I tried to find an unexplored topic which could link the city of Ghazni, which was one of my main research area of interest in the last years, with Nishapur. At Nishapur, the archaeologists of the Metropolitan brought to light carved alabasters employed in the decoration of some buildings. beside, of course, the more known stuccos and wall paintings. So I decided to compare them with the carved alabasters from Ghazni, which are largely unknown, still unpublished, not very much researched by myself, as not yet. I'm still at the beginning of this. And there are several parallels among these two productions, but there are possibly even some parallels among the alabaster from Nishapur and the Ghazni marbles, which is a point that needs, of course, to be evaluated. As pointed somehow before, in medieval times, the two cities were connected through a system of roads that, through Herat and Kandahar, finally led to India. So even if the two cities are quite distant, 900 miles, they were linked through this system of roads, one of the so-called Silk Roads connections. Ghazni is mostly known for having been the capital of the Ghaznavids from the end of the 10th century to the mid-12th century. The founder of this dynasty was a former slave of Turkic Central Asian origins who had been sold to a Samanid commander in Nishapur and who in the Samanid army had achieved the rank of general. He then was acclaimed governor of Ghazni in 977 and was able to establish there a dynastic succession. It was his son Mahmud, the famous Sultan Mahmud, as the sources call him, even if he wasn't officially a sultan, who became totally independent from the Samanids and expanded the reign from the central Iranian plateau to northwest India. Nishapur itself was under Ghaznavid control until 1037, so shortly after Mahmud's death. I want to show you first, to have a look first at the finds from the excavation at Nishapur, which I was able to look at the Metropolitan in the deposits before they were exhibited in the rooms upstairs, where you can see them today. Remember the beautiful maps showed before by Marika. This is the old one. So the first alabaster found in Nishapur was excavated at Tepe Madrasa. It is a lozenge-shaped inset with carved decoration, which was found in a courtyard immediately before the entrance of the prayer hall. Its specific employ is unknown, so we don't know exactly where it was used, but it must have been in a geometrical panel with inset technique, most probably a brick panel, and it points to the use of alabaster insets instead of the more common stucco or terracotta insets. There is a comparison in the facade of the Marocchi Attari Mosque in Bukhara, which is said to have had insets in alabaster. I have some doubts about it, and they are no more visible today, but this could be a comparandum. In addition to the former inset piece, at Vineyard Tepe, 3 fragments of alabaster-like white stone, identified as deidos, were retrieved in room V14. The archaeological evidences indicated that the building was probably destroyed by an earthquake, because there were collapsed walls and skeletons beneath them and other evidences. So Wilkinson thought that it was the earthquake of 1145. I think it possible to anticipate its destruction probably to an earlier earthquake, that of 1115, on the basis of our updated pottery chronology that we have today, and it was not available 30 years ago. The finding of these alabasters led to think that the building complex, in the words of the archaeologists, was inhabited by a person of high rank. However, there were no indication that the fragments had come from the decoration of the room itself. The first 2 on the left are 2 fragments of wall facings identified as deidos, The one on the left has a kind of knot which creates below a three-lobed element. In the center, we have a vegetal element formed with vegetal patterns. We can see that there are some possible iconographical parallels for these elements here in both in the marble, in the stucco decoration from Samarra, and also in the in the carved wood from Samarra. I show here some parallels, but the most striking one is shown upstairs in the galleries. It's a carved door, wooden door from Samarra, attributed to the 9th century, which shows exactly the same tri-lobed vegetal fleuron that we can see on the alabaster from Nishapur. The third fragment, found in the same room, is that of an epigraphic frame in floriated Kufic script. The remaining letters indicate the word possibly as-samawat, most probably from the Quranic throne words, which reads the famous Mafi Samawat or Mafil Ard, which refers to God's dominion over all things that are in the heavens and on earth. Of course, the fact that this could be a Quranic verse does not necessarily imply that the context of use was a religious building. We have seen that it was excavated in a house, in a private residence. So as for the techniques, these are the alabasters found in Nishapur, as far as I was able to detect from the publications and the cards here at the Metropolitan. The technique shows a flat bas relief, very low, with these typical small circular holes. The surfaces are smoothed but not polished, which is visible only, maybe not only with the naked eye, but with the feeling, with the touching it by hand. The tool marks are not visible, not even with a raking light, but what I can exclude is the use of toothed tools, which are not employed in Ghazni as well, and this marks a difference with the rest of the Islamic world more on the west, in the western territories of the Islamic world. So we can synthesize the technique, the tools employed, with a simple flat chisel, which was employed for carving, a pointed tool, which was employed for squaring the block, and a drill for making the holes. Traces of blue paint are found in the field of all the three fragments. You can see here in an enlarged photograph. So this is the architectural use which was detected in Nishapur. Beside this use, I just want briefly to mention that alabaster was also employed for funerary steles. The one on the left, both at the Metropolitan, the one on the left was excavated in Nishapur, and it's in exhibition as well. And I want to point out that this funerary tradition is completely different from the one we will see we have in Ghazni, which is in marble usually, and which are tombs with upper elements and lateral panels. So this as far as concerns the alabasters in Nishapur. The alabasters from Ghazni instead have been retrieved during the works of the Italian archaeological mission in the 1950s and 1960s. So we have more or less the same problems with an old documentation we have to deal with, the archaeology of the archaeology, so complicated situation with the documents. Some of the alabasters were brought to light during the excavations, others instead were documented, photographed, during surveys in the religious buildings of the Ghazni area. There are about 80 religious buildings that were recorded by the Italians in the, until the late 70s, in fact. This is an aerial photograph showing the archaeological area of Ghazni. In red, there are the two minarets, the only standing Ghaznavid monuments, mainly standing Ghaznavid monuments in Ghazni. In yellow, the excavated areas. This was the main excavation, the excavation of a large building where alabaster finds were also retrieved, even if only in small fragments, which do not help us and indicate a specific use in architecture. You can see instead that the main decorative feature of this building was the dados, so the marbles, which were employed for this dado on the courtyard. And this synthesized the marbles employed in the palace. You can see this on the upper, the first two on the top line, two dados. One had a Persian inscription, was on the courtyard. The one in the center had instead Arabic inscriptions with benedictory content. Then we have the basis of columns, rectangular facings with rectangular panels with this spiral decoration, and then this very large and high and wide paneling with an octagon motif. So, while the marble in Ghazni is quite well known, and other fragments were documented outside the building, the excavated buildings, alabaster are much less known. First of all, because most of the material is still unpublished, but then there is also has been often a misinterpretation between the two materials. And this ambiguity between marble and alabaster begins in the historical sources for us, as in Arabic there are two interchangeable terms for marble and alabaster, which are marmar and ruham. Sorry, these are some of the small alabaster fragments from the excavation. As you can imagine, they cannot tell us very much about their architectural use. So, as for the problem of the Arabic definition, this is a passage from Al-Utbi's Kitab al-Yamini. Al-Utbi was a secretary of the Ghaznavid and is an important source for Ghazni in the first half of the 11th century. The passage I'm showing here is noteworthy for several reasons. First, Al-Utbi describes a building that has not survived to us, the congregational mosque built in about 1018 by Sultan Mahmud. The mosque was known Aruz al-Falak, the Bride of Heaven. Al-Utbi also mentions a marble, a ruham pavement and dado that adorned the private chamber of the sovereign within the mosque, which was an elevated bite behind the maksura. And he tells us also that the dado was decorated with images of mihrabs, this is the terms he employs, and that it was painted with more colors. Then you can see he also mentions the provenance of this ruham as being Nishapur, but we will come back later on to this point. Alessio Bombaci, who analyzed the semantic implications of this passage, had suggested that the choice of the term ruham instead of marmar was made either to denote a colored marble or to indicate a fine, more valuable marble. Ruham, as a valuable stone, would first fit in with the general aim of a Al-Utbi description, which is always very praiseworthy. Praises the Sultan Mahmud and his endeavors. I would suggest that the term could refer to alabaster instead of marble, because I think that alabaster, it seems that the evidences show that it was much more valuable in Ghazni than the white marble, which was copiously found and which was extracted in a quarry nearby. Moreover, there was not one fragment of colored marble was found in Ghazni. So there were only about 1,000 artifacts and fragments of this very beautiful white marble. So, at any rate, marble and alabasters have been misinterpreted until recent times as well. The most striking example is that of these, which is the most renowned of the tombs in Ghazni, that of Mahmud, which is usually referred to as being in marble. But in fact, both the triangular top element and the lower part are in pinkish alabaster. As this rare color photograph shows us, the tomb is usually covered by a cloth and it's not visible. In 1962, the Italian archaeologists had the chance to restore, so they opened completely the monument and detected that in fact it is in alabaster. This is the only tomb of the hundreds of tombs in Ghazni of the Ghaznavid and Ghourid period, which is in alabaster. The others are in marble. And I suppose that the material was certainly chosen to nobilitate Mahmud's tomb. So, as for the assemblage of alabasters documented in Ghazni, they count about 35 pieces, among which, of course, many are fragmentary. I will show you briefly the most significant ones. The first group comprises rectangular panels bearing the image of an arch. This is a quite uniform group for the main features of composition, shape of arches, style of the Kufi script in the frame of the arches. But beside this composition, these features, the function of this panel was not univocal, must have been varied. The first, on the left, is one of the 4 similar panels found on Mahmud's tomb. The upper in the center was in the Rawza Museum, the lower down was in Kabul Museum. On the right, we have a panel which was partially found in excavations and partially purchased in Ghazni. The arch we see here is I call it a Persian horseshoe pointed arch, simple or with inner polylobated frame. This was the most common arch found in the Afghan territories, both in the Ghaznavid and in the Ghourid period. It's found, for example, in the palaces of the 11th century in Lashkari Bazar, in the Ghourid minaret at Jam, in the buildings in Sistan, and so on. But this arch is not found elsewhere, as far as I know, in Iran or in Central Asian buildings. Each arch is outlined by an epigraphic band in Kufic with the words Al-Mulk Lillah, the sovereignty belongs to God, which is a formula commonly found in the architectural inscriptions of both Ghaznavid and Ghourid period. Only in the 4 panels of Mahmud's tomb, this band bears instead Quranic verses, and other Quranic verses are also chosen for the border frames of the panels here on the left. The verses have all an eschatological meaning or are connected to God's supremacy, so they were clearly chosen for the funerary context in which these 4 slabs are still employed. We don't know the original context of the other panels. The one on the right was excavated in a private residence, and it differs very much, the frame, both in script, in language, and in content. Because you see the script is a cursive script, which is employed in Ghazni since the 2nd quarter of the 11th century in monumental epigraphy, but the style here would possibly point out to a later period, maybe in the 12th century. And the language of this inscription is Persian. So the panel was found in the excavation of this private residence, which was called the House of Plasterwares for a ceramic depot found intact in a niche. And this building was probably abandoned at the arrival of the Mongols in the early 13th century. You can see here the spot of the retrievement. Then we have a second group. that is that of alabaster frames. 3 are fragments bearing vegetal scrolls. They came all from the excavation of the palace of Masud III, but the stratigraphical indications are not very useful. They say they come from the courtyard. Then this frame shows a cursive script on a vegetal scroll, and it was exhibited in the Rauza Museum in Ghazni. And finally, the third group of fragments shares a similar shares a similar style of Kufic script with ornamental band on a field of rolling up scrolls. All descriptions could belong to a shahada, probably. Here as well, the religious content does not necessarily imply that the use of these panels, these frames, was within a religious building. All of them were found in Ghazni, where they were documented, but none from an archaeological context. And this is the last type of alabasters found in Ghazni, an inset most probably employed in carved brick panelings. So, if you compare the typologies found in Nishapur and in Ghazni, few are those which are shared in both sites. Only parallels are the 2 inset elements. The 3 Nishapur alabasters were most probably employed as dados, while in Ghazni, the function of dado was accomplished by marbles. As for the iconographic parallels, too, they are more easily identifiable with Ghazni marbles. So the Nishapur alabasters are more similar in certain ways to the Ghazni marbles rather than to the Ghazni alabasters. The same vegetal elements we have seen before is shown in a modified version in these dados. The first on the left comes from the palace of Masud III. The others were documented in other buildings in Ghazni. As for the technique of the alabasters in Ghazni, we have colors. They were originally painted in red and blue, and they were also gilded. And I was able to make analysis which detected the same minerals employed in Nishapur on baked bricks panels. So they were cinnabar, realgar for red, and ground lapis lazuli for blue. The carving technique also is different from that of the Nishapur alabaster. It shows a degree of sophistication which is only rarely seen on marbles. On the lower row, you see the 3 kind of bas-reliefs we have, of bas-relief techniques we have in the Ghazni marbles. And in the upper row are different kinds of Ghazni alabasters. So this degree of sophistication is because we have different kinds of bas-reliefs in the alabasters, which is another point for regarding them as a more valuable object in Ghazni. The alabaster bas-reliefs are often more rounded and especially are more deeper than the low flat bas-relief found on marbles of the Ghazni marbles. As for the surfaces, they are more smoothed and almost polished, while the marble objects, the one on the right you can see, are never polished and maintain instead the traces of the flat chisel which was employed to work them. These differences could be, of course, due to the softness of the material, because alabaster allows to work very easily at it's very soft, as if it was wood, but otherwise the differences could depend on the higher attention given to a more valuable material. We have seen, in fact, that in Nishapur, where alabaster was easily obtainable, probably, the surface is not polished at all, and the bas-reliefs are flat and low. And you see it, so you have an alabaster from Nishapur with low, flat bas-relief on the left, similar to the marble from Ghazni on the right, and in the center is the Alabasters from Ghazni, which has a polished surface. Another circumstantial evidence could support the suggestion that alabaster was not too easily found in Ghazni, at least in some periods perhaps. 3 pieces are carved on both sides. I don't know if they were carved so as freestanding elements, but the patterns do not seem to me suitably oriented, especially the central fragment, one with the other. So it seems that they were simply re-employed. Going back to Alutbe's passage, he mentions Nishapur as being the provenance of the stone employed in the Arus al-Falak mosque in Ghazni. The expression could have, of course, a rhetoric connotation, as Alutbe is very colorful in his descriptions. However, at the time Mahmud built the Arus al-Falak, Nishapur was still under the Ghaznavids. And moreover, what is significant, marble quarries were worked in the district of Behaq, west of Nishapur. I was not able to go into the sources yet to identify if this in Behaq was a marble or an alabaster quarry, but of course it's interesting for us to see that in Nishapur no marbles were found at all, and we have only alabaster fragments. So maybe thinking that Alutbe's passage could be likely in terms of provenance of the Ghazni alabaster is probably pushing it too much. And moreover, there are also several other alabaster deposits in Afghanistan. So only analysis could prove that the Nishapur and the Ghazni alabasters have the same provenance, and we could possibly even organize this. Without going too far, the significance of this passage could be understood in terms of an embellishing comparison with a region which was known for its earlier alabaster tradition, that of Nishapur, to which possibly the Ghazni production made reference. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. We are at the end. This was the last panel, so I would like to invite all the speakers to come to the podium. And if we can turn on the lights, and then now it's time for questions and discussion.
Thank you very much for a fascinating panel. I have a question for Professor Bulliet. I'm not sure I got this point from your talk. So in the end, why did Nishapur become such a large city, and when?
Well, that was the second half of the talk that I did not get around to because I realized my time was constrained. Looking at the social history of Nishapur at its peak, particularly at the dominant social stratum of religious scholars, it appears that about 40% of all of the eminent religious scholars in Nishapur in the 800s and the 900s came from families that made their fortunes from growing cotton and selling cotton cloth. It was an ideal terrain for cotton because you had a Piedmont area that had water resources, and if you built underground canals, you could have perennial water flow, which meant that you could irrigate land in the summer, which you could not do from the normal surface runoff from snow or rain in the winter. And this made it possible to make use of the long growing season in an Iranian summer. There was a boom in cotton in Iran in the 800s and 900s that really was the central transformative factor, I think, in cities all over the interior Iranian plateau. And I think Iran really became Nishapur became primarily a city that prospered from the cotton industry. This, incidentally, just to finish the story, this pretty much came to an end in the 11th century when you had a very distinct change in the climate. And for about 135 years, you had recurrent cold winters everywhere from Baghdad east. And this climate change pretty much destroyed much of the agricultural regime, and certainly the cotton regime in northern Iran. I've explained this at some detail in my book, Cotton, Climate, and Camels in Early Islamic Iran, so if you want the details, you can go there. But I would just point out that this cold period in the northern Middle East coincided with the so-called medieval warm period in Europe, and as part of the entire shift in the balance between a culturally and economically dynamic Islamic world and a rather backward post-Roman European world to the opposite, to a dynamic commercial revolution in Italy during and Northern Europe during the medieval warm period, and a decline of the economy in the northern Middle East, not along the Mediterranean, but Iraq and Iran, eastern Anatolia, starting to some degree in the 900s, but primarily in the first decade of the 1000s.
Thank you. Very impressive how you combine again research and presentation in the exhibition, which I love very much. Now, when I was seeing the panels in the small room, just out of curiosity, because we are also thinking about presenting panels, you're not afraid that people hit them and drop their backs or whatever against them. After you said you will work with drawers. How you have already experienced since November how people react to these open-hanging, very low-hanging panels?
That definitely was a concern, and there were various solutions proposed, but we didn't want to keep the panels behind glass, which was one of the original ideas. They've installed security cameras in that area instead, but it is hard for the guards to patrol because it's in a corner. But so far, I haven't heard of any damage to the panels, but one of the reasons the drawers are now closed for the moment is, because of that safety question too. So we're still working through that.
I have a question for our last speaker about the quotation which was used from Wypyski. It describes a very brightly colored setting. And when we see the panels from Ghazni today, you obviously with certain magnification one sees traces of color. But do you imagine that the color scheme that Wypyski describes with brilliant gold and red and blue, that we should imagine that that was the way it looked when it was functioning in the building?
Unfortunately, yes. So they were not beautiful white. And in the notebooks of the archaeologists who excavated the palace of Masud III in the 1950s, they always remark the fact that the marbles had these evident traces of colors but they have, unfortunately, they are completely lost now after 50 years, after having been brought to light. So, in fact, the traces have been found all over the marbles. And as for the alabasters, I have found them in 3 fragments, but as you have seen, sometimes in a quite consistent way. So alabasters as well were not employed for the translucent feature of the material, but they were completely covered with mainly, we have found for the moment only red and blue and gilding. Lutby, of course, speaks of the flowers, of the colors of the wallflowers and different hues. But this has also other connotations, as you can imagine.
You answered my question whether the sense of the material alabaster that we have, of a translucent material, attractive partly for that quality, was probably not the quality that they were interested in cultivating, because they were covering up. That quality would not have been visible, as you understand it, to the person who visited the building when it was in use.
Probably not. Mm-hmm. There are even some, for example, we have the Mahmud tombs, which is in alabaster, but which is in a pinkish alabaster. The color photograph shows that at least the inscription that frames the 4 rectangular panels on the sides of the tomb, they were colored as well. So evidently the idea to bring possibly some luxurious materials from far away possibly was enough to add value to this material.
So it's the difficulty of obtaining the material rather than necessarily its visual character that was adding value in people's eyes, you're suggesting.
Possibly.
Interesting. Thank you.
Just because I'm interested in glass, the link to Samara seems clear to me also from the way of cutting the glass with this kind of small scratches. You find it in the 9th century, but in the 10th century then this also is practiced in Cairo. Can you imagine with glass any kind of direction to Cairo, or is that too far fetched?
I'm having a little trouble hearing your question because the way the sound is here. So.
Very short. By the technique, it looks also very close to Fatimid glass. Not only Abbasid Samarra, but also then later Fatimid Cairo. Do you see, or do you have any hint in this direction, or?
I'm not an expert on the stylistic, so I can't comment on similarities or differences. There's certainly very chemically a lot of similarities with the Samarra glass to the type 1 Nishapur, and I wouldn't be surprised to see that if that's where it came from. You asked about Cairo, glass from Cairo, yeah. That I don't know. So it may be that the luster glass may be from Cairo, but we only have the one piece from Nishapur, so.
I'm amazed at the scholarship and detail of these presentations and of the research in Nishapur. Is there, and this is open to any of our panelists, is there anything you would say is distinctive from the research and study of Nishapur which is not found anywhere else in the Middle East?
I guess there's one group of ceramics that seems to be only made at Nishapur, so speaking from the point of view of the objects, if you go up to the galleries, there's a section of ceramics which are called buffware that have covered surface with all different kinds of geometric and also figural patterns, and also have a distinctive palette of yellows and green colors. And so from that point of view, Nishapur is unique from the creation of these ceramics in particular. From other points of view?
Well, Nishapur is particularly known for the slip-coated whiteware with dark calligraphy around it, which is also identified as Samarkand. But what I think this represents is the rise of the cotton industry, in which there was a prohibition in Islam on men wearing silk garments. And this was stated in many, many hadith of the Prophet. It's very clear that there was a alternative notion that men should wear plain colored garments, white or black or striped perhaps, but not silk brocades of the sort that were commonplace in the Sassanid period. This contributed to the idea, and there are hadith that specifically support this, that plain white with an embroidery of silk was a desirable sort of garment to wear. So there were factories established by the caliphate to produce what was called tiraz, which would be a plain or a striped fabric with a embroidered calligraphy. And I think that the pottery of white pottery with ornate inscriptions is actually a translation of tiraz into ceramics, and that it was characteristic of heavy cotton growing areas that were trying to enforce the idea that Muslim men should dress the way Iranian clerics currently dress, in huge expanses of plain fabric. By the late 900s, this attempt had more or less failed, and you have a return to silk embroidered, or silk brocade garments after that time. So I think that distinctive Nishapur pottery is not distinctive just of Nishapur, but rather of a period of ideological contestation between an aesthetic based on plain white or plain black with calligraphy versus a ornamentation based, as Marika said, on vegetable motifs and figurative motifs that would go back to the Sassanid period. So this is not distinctive of Nishapur, but rather it would be distinctive of a particular period in the history of Iran. And I think that's the point I want to make, is that when you're dealing with materials over a period of centuries, as a historian, I'm very uncomfortable with unless we distinguish, this century versus that century versus another century, so that Nishapur might have been distinctive at one point, but not necessarily categorically over time.